it's obvious that Africa has to move forward and leap forward, but there are a number of basic things that we need to do to really make it happen.
Basic things that need to happen. When you look at it, what major challenges do you foresee?
Well, probably the biggest one is the infrastructure deficits, which infrastructure development and industrialization really go hand in hand. It's very hard to industrialize if you can't transport your goods efficiently to the ports. It's very hard to industrialize if power is unreliable or very expensive, things of that nature. Very difficult to industrialize if you're in a relatively small market and you can't easily export to regional markets. So these are some of the things that have to take place for industrialization to become a reality.
So they need to take a look at the entire value chain, of the industrialization process and see how they can plug the leaks and,
Absolutely, but I don't want us to get paralyzed by studies. We've done that a lot in Africa. I think we now need to move into careful execution and implementation. And there's a few things that the governments need to do to make this happen, and there's a few things that the private sector needs to do to make these things happen. I think we should get on with it.
We're looking at Africa now, 54 countries, all with their unique challenges, But how do you find that unifier, that every other country can latch onto and, and plug into this new drive?
Well, the unifier is that the people deserve and want a better quality of life. So we need to raise the income levels of the average African. That should be at the forefront of everything that we're trying to do. In today's world, it's a global world. We need to compete. We need to be competitive. We need to sell our goods, not just the raw materials. We need to add value at home. We need to employ our people. We need to increase the quality of life for our citizens. All of this comes through, many of this comes through economic activity, and that's the focus.
But when you look at the quantity and consistency of capital that needs to come into developing the entire value chain, how do you see us surmounting this?
I don't get caught up in Africa needs 100 billion, 100 trillion, or whatever every year. Let's just work on the basics. Let's get transactions right, the environment right. I think the rest will take care of itself. So for me, we need to start working on making sure that we close more transactions, and that those transactions, because success breeds success. If we talk about the problems all the time and we don't do anything, we won't get anywhere. So I'm a believer in you start 80%, 90% is better than 20% of nothing. So let's focus on the things. And there's enough lessons now of how to do things properly in Africa in terms of private sector investment, galvanizing investment, that there's enough to build upon now. And we know what doesn't work as well.
So, but when you look at the opportunities that have been talked about in the fourth industrial revolution, how do you see Africa doing this and leapfrogging in many of the other industries that we're looking at?
I think there's a few things that Africa has an advantage in. Okay, first of all, a young population. And if I just look at my own children, their ability to grasp technology is 10 times better than mine. And we're a growing young population, as you know, in Africa. So that's a huge opportunity. What we need to do is we need to create the environment by which young people can reach their potential, their full development. Now with internet and connectivity, we know what's happening globally. Our young people know what's happening globally, and they want to have a chance to compete and be part of it. Now, what do we need to do as the people in charge? Well, we need to make sure that we have things like consistent, reliable, affordable electricity. Power. You can't build a manufacturing plant if your power is not reliable or cheap. We need to do the basic infrastructure things that all developed countries have done. Africa has a challenge because if you look at most of the developed markets, the basic infrastructure was done by the public sector. They were driven by governments. Our governments, unfortunately, don't have the capacity and the resources to do it. So we need to involve private sector more than maybe the Germanys and the US needed to do hundreds of years ago. But therein lies the opportunity because there's new innovative ways of doing things. There's lots of capital available. Africa's problem is not a lack of money. Africa's problem is a lack of bankable projects that money can go into. So if we create those bankable projects in the right circumstances, the capital will come to us. I have no doubt about that.
I also think policy plays a huge role in this conversation. I'd like you to speak to this and how well, like I mentioned earlier, 54 countries, how to have some policies that at least, maybe not the one size fits all, but at least something that makes things work.
Yes, I agree with you. I think policy is critical. I think consistency of policy is equally as important. The challenge we have is that, okay, democracy is good, but the political cycle means that things can change and policies can change. And we have to try and get to a situation where even if there's a change of government, the basic forms of policy remain the same. Because most investors invest beyond a political cycle, especially if you're looking at infrastructure. You're asking somebody to invest for 10, 15 years. So there will be elections in that time. If the government changes and all the rules change, that's going to scare investors away from investing. So consistency of policy, I think, is something that we need to work on. Of course, different governments are going to have different emphasis, but I think we can all agree that attracting private sector investment, both internationally and domestically, into productive areas is good for the country. And I think that should be the focus of many of our policies.